We'd like to welcome our next presenter is Rabbi Chaim Goldberg. Rabbi Chaim Goldberg is one of our senior rabbinic coordinators here at OU Kosher. Senior in terms of, I don't know, junior. Okay, don't give me those looks. Is one of our rabbinic coordinators here, also a group leader. He's in charge of a group of rabbanim here at the OU. His specialty, among other things, are potatoes and fish, not necessarily together in that order or cooked together. And he is a Muslim of Yeshivas Rabbeinu, Mesivta Yeshiva Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin, and at one point in time found himself in Stuyvesant High School as well. And with that, I will let Rabbi Goldberg take it away and tell us what's fishy and what's not fishy.
We're here to talk about fish. We're here to talk about fish. I'll tell you that the problem that we often find when people deal with fish questions, and that is that people consider themselves experts in what is and isn't acceptable and kosher by virtue of the fact that they learned a pasuk chumash. What do I mean by that? You know, if I would tell you that a fellow wants to paskin a Yeridea Shaila based on an English translation on a pasuk chumash, right? He wants to figure out what's called a kasher mikvah, or he wants to figure out whether this is considered a ma'aseh ksiva and a mezuzah. You would say that reading a pasuk chumash with an English translation is not the way to go about deciding a thing like that. And suddenly, when it comes to kosher fish, that's the normal way the person paskins a shaila. And I love telling the story about a fellow many years ago now. As Rael mentioned, I'm a senior now. Many years ago, a fellow called me up and was asking about an article I had written. I don't even remember where, and it had mentioned that shark isn't kosher. And after proving that he's an emes Talmid Chacham in a million different ways, he questioned on what veracity I would claim that shark isn't kosher. He had looked it up and seen in the encyclopedia, because we used to use those way back when, that sharks have fins and scales. So if it has fins and scales, who am I to say that it's not kosher? Obviously, I mean, it's a bad question. If it's not obvious, let me tell you why it's not obvious. Let me tell you why it should be obvious in my mind. The Torah doesn't use the word fins and scales to describe kosher fish. It uses the words snaper v'kaskesa. And it doesn't exactly mean fins and scales, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. First of all, the Gemara in Chulin, Daf Samach Vav Beis, tells us that all kosher fish which have kaskeses have snaper. And that practically speaking, we're not going to be interested in whether a fish has a snapper or not, because all we need to know is if it has kaskeses. And I'll tell you what a kaskeses is. We'll look at how to figure it out for yourself. Whatever you need to know, you'll figure it out. But the bottom line is that the fact that a fish has fins and scales does not make it have snapper kaskeses. Why? Well, the Ramban in Chumash, on the pasuk in Vayikra, the Yud Aleph pasuk Tes, the Ramban tells us that a kaskeses is not just a scale, but a specific type of scale, a scale that can be removed from the fish without ripping the skin. Okay. In the case of shark, they do have scales. Many of them do have scales. They have a type of scale that cannot be removed from the fish without ripping the skin, because that type of scale is the skin, effectively makes up the skin. Its texture is much more similar to that of a fingernail, and it's attached to the body of the fish much the same way that your fingernail is attached to the end of your finger, and much the same way that it would cause serious damage if you attempted to remove a fingernail from the finger. But that's not the definition of a kosher fish. The definition of a kosher fish is a fish which has a scale that can be removed with a hand or with a knife without ripping the skin. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So anytime somebody calls me up to ask me if a certain fish has fins and scales, I'm already a little bit nervous. Why a fellow's asking me about fins? That means he's not too familiar with what practically we're looking for and didn't have any kind of training in what he's looking for. When a mashgiach asks a question like that, it really makes me nervous. But we're going to show you how to do it. It's really not hard at all. We'll answer some questions. We'll talk about some OU policies. Hopefully we'll have a good time. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. I have some beautiful samples here. This is a very miuchastic bronzino, which came from a factory that the OU has just begun certifying. And the reason we're certifying it is because they want to make a smoked bronzino in the same factory as this raw bronzino. But this is a raw bronzino. And I want to talk about it because this is a great fish to handle and to deal with. First of all, what exactly is a snapper kaskeses? Okay, so snapper is not so mafurish in the Rishonim what of the fins that the fish is dealing with is the one that's referred to as snapper. Why? So Pashtus, the snapper that we're referring to, is the pectoral fins. That would be the fins over here. Okay, think of it like the wings on a fish. Rashi describes the Mishnah in Nida. I think it's Samach Nun Tes in Nida. Rashi says that it's Hushashat Behem, something to that effect, that he uses it for swimming with. So that would seem to describe pectoral fins. A lot of times you'll see pictures of fish being kosher. They'll point to the dorsal fin over the back. I don't think that's correct. This fish's dorsal fin was removed because, practically speaking, when you buy fish in the fish store, they usually cut off this fin because it's pointy and it'll poke through the plastic, which makes it less desirable as a consumer to be purchasing a fish that, you know, it's drying out or otherwise doesn't look good. So they're usually going to cut these off. Of no consequence to us anyways, because in addition to the dorsal fin, the pectoral fin, the tail fin is definitely not. That was called the zonav. There's an anterior, the anal fin. There's some anterior dorsal fins. So there's plenty of fins on this fish. It doesn't really matter, as I mentioned before. The Gemara says, Kol sheyesh bei kaskeses yesh bei snapping. Now, where's the kaskeses on this fish? Okay, so the kaskeses are the scales anywhere on the fish, anytime during its life cycle. So practically speaking, what we're going to do is we're going to first try to figure out if this fish is cleaned or not, meaning did the fellow who sold it to me try to remove the scales. In this case, he did. He removed a lot of them. There's a loose one. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that so well on the webcam, but there's a couple of loose ones. Those don't count. Loose scales on the fish don't count because you can't know that it came from this fish. It might have come from another fish that was next door or close by and they rubbed off. That actually happened. It was a very fun thing that happened during a presentation at another school. I was handling a shark and as I was saying, oh, here's a scale, and I put it on the side and I keep talking about it. And somebody who was paying attention said, I thought you said sharks don't have scales. Very good. They don't. And yet this one did. Why is that? Because it's not from the shark. It was in the bag, loose together with other fish that were kosher. And therefore the scale just rubbed off and that's what happened. Anyhow, so first thing we're going to do is just try and see if there's any loose scales on there and rub that off. Okay. Now, when scales are going to be attached to a fish, they're going to be attached on the side closer to the head, and they're going to be loose on the side closer to the tail. So if you can imagine the doors on a car, yeah? So the door is going to open on the driver's side with your left hand and swing out this way. And on the passenger side, you're going to open with your right hand, and it's going to swing out that way. And the reason for it is, of course, that you need to keep your aerodynamics, right? The car is going to be driving forward. In the process of driving forward, the wind's going to be blowing up the front of the car. And if the doors would open the opposite way, the wind would kind of cut into the car, into the gasket, and yank the door off the hinges as it was driving. A similar force would act on the fish if, I mean, not to the same extent, but the same idea, if it was swimming and the water, the aquadynamics would, you know, cut into the scales and kind of yank them off. Fish need their scales for protection, both from large predators and small microscopic sized ones, things that would try to leach onto it and suck blood through the sides. So if it has significant damage in scales, it usually won't survive. So the scales always have to remain intact. So what you're going to do to check if it has scales is you're going to scratch the fish gently against the grain. Yeah. So if you could imagine, you know, when you pet a cat and you go from the head towards the tail, or a dog, right? The hairs always run that way. If you go the other way, you ever notice the cat or the dog kind of gets annoyed at you? It doesn't feel good. It's like when you take somebody's hair and you go the wrong way. So the same thing you're going to do on your fish. The scales are going to line up like this. You're going to scratch this way. You're going to try and pull some scales off. Now, this was cleaned pretty well. Let's see if I can get a little closer. Can you see that? Let's see. I'm going to try and guess this is the camera you're looking at. So I'm going to scratch it like this. And I pulled up a couple of small ones right there. Now I'm going to catch some more here by the head. That's probably a better example. Can you see that? Yeah, I'm going to flick them off. I put a plastic tablecloth over my laptop to kind of keep it safe. But here, so I just scratched a couple scales off the head. There's some discussion where the scales have to be found. Pashas, we hold one scale anywhere on the fish is good enough. There's some discussion in Tosefta that maybe you have to find it tachas lechiav or tachas snapier, which might be over here as well. I don't remember if it says al shedra. I don't remember by the tail. it seems like it's going on the outskirts of the fish as opposed to across the middle, which would make sense because the most likely place to prove that came from this fish would be in places where it's not going to rub up against somebody else. In this case, the scales are all clearly attached to the fish right along the head. So again, I'm going to try to put them down so you can see that a little bit better. And there's lots of scales around on the head. They're definitely attached to the fish. They definitely came from this fish. Therefore, this is a dug tar. And that's why we are certifying the Bronzino coming out of this factory. And maybe we'll talk about how we get the hot smoke product certified as well. So that is a Bronzino, also known as Mediterranean sea bass. It's got a lot of other names as well. Doesn't really matter. It's a delicious fish, more on the expensive side, but you know, if you're a rich guy and you need something a little bit fancier, go for it. So that's an easy fish to tell because the scales are large and it's quite easy to see if they're attached or not. A lot of times we get phone calls about a fish called trout, particularly in the summertime when people are fishing. Trout can be found in local brooks, especially. You can sometimes get lake trout, other places, especially in the mountains where people tend to go for summer vacations. I'm going to try and hold this up in different angles, trying to figuring out which camera angle you can see it best from. So trout has very small scales, and usually when you buy trout in the store, they're not cleaned. By not cleaned, I mean that the scales are still intact. So you're usually going to find that the gut is open, gutless, just like your favorite politician. They clean out the guts, they wash it out nicely, and then they will clip the dorsal fin again. And a lot of times they will scale it, but not necessarily. The first mistake people make in trying to check the kosher status of a trout is that it's covered with slime. A healthy fish is covered with slime, kind of a mucus, similar to when you have a cold, covered with a mucus. In order to check the scales, you got to get through the mucus. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to try to get in there and pull the slime off like that in order to get it off the fish. So just slide your fingers down the body of the fish, do like that, and now you're down to the actual body of the fish. In this case, the trout was clean, but not terribly well, but you can still tell, and it's pretty easy to do. So what you're going to do, again, you're going to scratch from the back towards the front, and I got a bunch by the head over here, so I'm just going to hold that up a little bit and hope that you can see it even better. How's that? Can you see those on my fingernail? Yeah. Try the webcam over here. And you should be able to see at least some of them. But yeah, definitely scales right there on the top of the head, and the whole body of the fish actually had scales as well. Rebelsky was not comfortable with relying on what they call the base moisha of kaskasim. If you look at the fish, you kind of see where the scales used to be. There's some question about if you could rely on that because not everyone is careful enough to know when the scales are embedded underneath the skin and when they would be on top of the skin and just have been scraped off. Somebody could accidentally think that this is the type of fish that had scales and that they were removed when in fact they were subcutaneous underneath the skin. Subcutaneous scales obviously are not kaskasim because if they're subcutaneous, the only way to get to them would be to damage the skin, ripping through the skin in order to be able to scrape them off. Okay, so that is a Bronzino, that's a trout. I had some other interesting examples for you. One thing I got today is a nice find. This, you can see that, this is a fantastic example. This is a Greenland turbot. Greenland turbot is a great fish to play with for a few reasons. First of all, turbot has lots of politics involved with it. Many, many years ago, the London Bezdin had a fundraising dinner and they served turbot. Somebody, and it was under Hashgacha, obviously, it was a London Bezdin dinner. Somebody had questioned the turbot that they were serving and whether it was kosher or not. And everyone assumed that turbot was kosher because everyone eats turbot. Now here's a problem when everyone does something and people aren't careful about the specifics. Whoever it was, whoever the caterer was that was bringing in this turbot, the mashgiach never bothered to check the sample fish that they were bringing in with skin on, never bothered to check it to confirm that it was a turbot that in fact was kosher, and it wasn't. There's a species that is referred to now as European turbot that does not have simanim on it at all. It's not a dug tar, and it's also called turbot. So the caterer had bought what they now call European turbot. So I was told that the London Bezdin fish list we don't hold a fish list. Maybe we'll talk about that later. The London Bezdin fish list does not list turbot as a kosher fish at all, but I assure you that turbot is most certainly kosher, assuming you get the kind that actually has some on it. So this turbot, despite my request not to clean it by my local fish store, was cleaned. Makes it a little tougher to check it out. So here's what happens. So turbot, the most of the meat is right behind the head. This is a general rule by fish, by the way. Usually you take the head off, and most of the meat is going to be this area right behind the head. Yield on a fish is about 40%, give or take. So if you buy a whole fish, and let's say it's a pound of fish, right? Or let's make it easy. Let's make it 10 pounds. So if you're going to get a 40% yield, that means 4 pounds of a 10-pound fish are actually flesh that you could eat. The rest is going to be head, guts, bones, skin, parts that you can't eat from the fish. So you always want to think about that when you're trying to figure out how much fish you need, for example, to feed a crowd. You want to figure out what the yield is relative to the round price to figure out how much fish you're actually going to get off it. What's interesting about flat fishes like this is they're called flat for a reason. This is pretty narrow, less than a finger's breadth, half a finger across. Very narrow fish, but this is 3 pounds of turbot. They didn't cut the gut out. What they did is they take the head off, and when they take the head off, see the gut cavity right there. So they just pull the guts out this way. They're very narrow guts. Many flatfishes, most flatfish, maybe that's what they're called flatfish, really grow like this. I really was hoping they would leave the head on, but they didn't. In flatfishes, you'll notice that there's one eye that looks a little bit funny, and there's a socket on one side with no eye in it. What happens is when flatfishes are young, they swim like this, actually, like normal fishes. As they get older, they mature and they flip to a side. It's hard to tell without the head on, I can't remember. And I'm pretty sure it went over the nose this way. I'm pretty sure, but if I'm wrong, I apologize. And what you'll see is that the eye will migrate over the bridge of the nose onto this side. So there'll be a blind side that faces down and a sighted side that faces up. With something like a halibut, you can see it very easily because the blind side is going to be white and the top side is going to be a green or brown or something else. Why? Because that's a natural defense the Abishter put in it for predators. If it's white, so you're not going to be able to see it if you're underneath the fish looking up because it's going to look like the sun. And if it's green on the top, you're not going to be able to see looking down if you're a predator from above because it's going to match the camouflage of the ground below. It's just an interesting thing. Another thing that's interesting about flatfishes is that they typically have 2 different types of scales. They have stenoid scales, which are kind of shaped like a comb. That's why it's called stenoid, from the Latin word stena, which refers to comb-like fishes. Comb-like stena, little rays in the scale. And if you're able to get one from a perciform fish, for example, perch-like fishes have those kind of scales. Maybe something like a tilapia would even have scales like that, those kind of square kind of scales. And if you look very closely, it looks like it has like one of those old black Chinese fans. Do you remember having those as a kid? You kind of opened it up and waved at yourself. Anyhow, so that shape going across on the scale on one side. And the other side, they have cycloid scales, cycloid, CYC, meaning round. And that's very rare. You don't find that normally on a fish. You would have the same type of scale on both sides of the fish. In this case, it's just an interesting quirk they were able to put into it. So in this case, the guy did actually a much better job of cleaning it than I hoped he'd do. I've got some very vague feeling on it, but he actually cleaned it way too well. Oh, that's disappointing. Okay, well, I bought it from a kosher fish store, so you'll take my word on it. But anyhow, if you look carefully, oh, here we go. Yeah, let's see if I can get some of these guys out. And I'll hold it up to the camera. Can you see that? How's that? See it on my thumb? Yeah, that should work. See it on this one. Okay, anyhow, yeah. So right here at the tip of the fish, the skin looked a little bit darker, and I realized that means that he didn't scrape it so well with his scaler knife, and that's where the scales are going to be found. If you're careful and you give it the time, you can usually find scales somewhere on the fish, and again, all you need is one scale anywhere on the fish. Now, when I say one scale anywhere on the fish, I mentioned earlier, it means any time during its life cycle, if it would have a scale, it's really a dog tar. Piskei Tshuva proves that Because the Gemara talks about a fish that's asi lagabel kaskeses. It's going to grow kaskeses. It's already tar. So the question is, all right, well, before we get there. So if it's going to grow kaskeses, meaning it doesn't have scales on it right now, but it will have scales on it later in life, it's a min tar, meaning you don't need to see the scales to be matter it. You just need to know it's the type of fish that has scales, that this specific example of fish will eventually have scales on it. So the question is, if it doesn't have scales on it right now, how do I eat from it? How do I know that it's a dog tar? So that's the question. So Fishy Tshuva at the beginning of Pei Gimel talks about that. And he says, well, it's totally in a tviyasayin. If a person was able to look at the fish and recognize what species of fish it was, you could eat it based on that. So a lot of times people ask, oh, come on, Rabbi, who has tviyasayin on fish? Okay, so I'll tell you a very nice story. I was going to bring a piece of herring, because in the good old days, they used to sell old-fashioned herring, the jarred herring with the skin still on it. And I would hold up a piece of herring and I would say, well, what is this? And people would say, well, that's herring. And I'd say, how do you know it's herring? And the fellow would say, well, because I know what herring looks like, and that's clearly herring. And I say, very good. That was tviyasayin. But nowadays, everybody wants the Schwartz's stuff that's all sauce and very little fish. So they don't sell the old-fashioned herring with the skin still on it. I tried 2 different stores, actually 3 stores, 2 stores for sure, did not have any brand of old-fashioned herring. So too bad on that. One time I was giving this presentation in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was showing them how they could buy fish at the local non-certified fish store and what would be involved and how to deal with it. And there were some people who came, this is something we don't find in New York too much. There were some people who came who were not Shomer Shabbos. They weren't religious at all. And they, they're part of the Jewish community. They're trying whatever level they are holding by. They wanted to hear a shiur. So they came. So there was one woman who came, and I was presenting, and I picked up a bag of whiting, which is another fish that's very cheap, and it's typically not scaled because scaling would add cost to the whole product, and nobody's interested in that. So I pulled out a piece of whiting, and I started talking about it, and the woman said, oh, that's whiting. I said, how do you know? And she said, well, what do you mean? My mother made whiting all the time. I know what whiting is. Who doesn't know what whiting is? So I, turned to everybody and said, you all saw that, right? That wasn't a plant in the crowd. She knows what it is, and she called it out. She has a tviyasayin on it. So if somebody else in this room wasn't sure if this was a dog tar or not, you would theoretically be allowed to ask this woman, assuming that she was Shomer Shabbos or became Shomer Shabbos later in life, then you could ask her, is this kosher whiting? And she would be able to answer you whether it is or not. So that would be a tviyasayin if it didn't yet grow scales or the scales fell out. Scales falling out is very common. So herring is an example of a fish whose scales fall out when it comes out of the yam. You may have remembered hearing the Gemara talk about that. There is a I want to say the Fishy Tshuva at the beginning of Pei Gimel talks about that. Beginning of Pei Gimel, not the Fishy Tshuva, the Fishy Tshuva. I quotes from the Shiva Sian if I had a question about that. There was that he quotes the Gemara that had the Maisa where somebody had a certain fish and they said that it was a dog tar, but it loses its scales coming out, and they took it out of the yam. They had some fishermen catch it and hold it underwater, and they lined the net with a brand new clean black shmata, put the fish in the net with the shmata. When they pulled it up, it was full of kaskas, and everybody say, okay, so now we know it's a dog tar because the scales clearly shed off of the fish. There's lots of fish that happens too. Herrings are one of them. Anything in the clupiform family. Mackerels also typically lose their scales coming out, which makes it hard to know if a mackerel is kosher. There are some mackerels that are purported to never have scales. Difficult to know because even the kosher mackerels very rarely can be found with scales on them. So you need to have tviyasayin. Somebody would need to have tradition or be able to recognize it and say, hey, I know what that fish is. We always used to eat it in my family, in my community, whatever it is. Somebody would have to be shomer Torah mitzvahs and familiar with this specific fish to be able to say, I know for a fact this fish is tar. It's not the kind of Masorah that we have on animals or birds so much as, an edus of sorts that this person knows and that this fish is a dog tar. Okay. So there's a question about a fish. Let's say I wasn't able to get any good ones in the store. All the tilapia in my store were skinned. I didn't want that even with a hashgacha because I don't want to deal with that. But let's say I would have a piece of a white fish, plain white fish. A lot of times I get phone calls about somebody asking about tilapia with no skin. They want to know, is this kosher fish or not? To which my question is, how do you know it's tilapia? And I had a mice like that many years ago. I'm getting less fish calls lately, I just realized. Many years ago, a fellow from out of town called me up and wanted to know if tilapia was a kosher fish. And I asked him why he wants to know, and he said that he is manning the kosher fish department at his local supermarket, and he wants to know if he can accept the tilapia into the kosher fish department. And I asked him, how does he know it's tilapia? And he said, what do you mean? The box clearly says tilapia on it. So the box says tilapia, so it must be tilapia. I said to him, is there any skin on it? Could you check it for scales? He said, Rabbi, I wouldn't bother calling you if it had skin on it. I'd just check it myself. The question is that it doesn't have skin on it. Okay, so that's a problem, because once you take the skin off of a fish, it's kirei dagim. It's effectively that the Chazal answered, the guts of fish with no hashgacha on it. We can't assume that it came from a dug tar, because once it's got all the simanim removed on it, it's blank. It could be anything, and we have to be concerned. It's at least a chashash d'Rabbanan, suffix d'Oraisa, that it came from a dug tummy. There's no way to know what fish it came from, and you can't claim an uman leimaram nasei on it at all, especially since the FDA themselves back in 1993 had an article warning people that they're kind of trying to enforce it, but it's not going all that great. And species substitution is a major issue that, if you watch the right news agencies, is happening regularly and rampantly in some places, ad hayom, meaning that somebody takes a low-value fish and they bless it with a new name, and the Shinei Hashem comes with Shinei Mazel, and now it's an expensive fish. So they take a certain kind of catfish, which comes from Southeast Asia, for example, called basa, B-A-S-A, not a dug tar. No catfish is kosher. And they take the basa and they rename it grouper. And they sell it in Florida, where grouper is an expensive fish, comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and very, very popular fish. Doesn't look anything like grouper. Doesn't look anything like grouper, but it's a lot cheaper. You can't make a lot of money off it. So they sell it as grouper. And amazingly, that the grouper that comes from Southeast Asia sells a lot better than the local stuff. So the local grouper fishermen one time sponsored somebody to check DNA on lots of different restaurants in Florida. And they found that 9 out of 10 that they sampled were not selling grouper at all. They were selling fake catfish that was just labeled as grouper. When FDA knows about it, they go after it when they can, but they haven't got all the manpower to do it. And they don't feel that there's a major emergency when it comes to an economic fraud issue, which is how they view species substitution, economic fraud. No one's going to die, in the physical world at least, from eating the wrong species. It's only in the spiritual world. So whenever those stories come to the OU, I always answer, to me, it's not a question anyways, because you never had a heter to eat skinless fish. You can't read the box. You can't play the uman loy marum nasa game, because there's no uman here. The fellow who gets caught doing it didn't even necessarily do anything wrong himself. He bought a box marked grouper from a guy who told him it was grouper. That guy may have believed that it was grouper because he got it from a distributor who got it from somebody else, who got it from somebody who put the name on the box. And maybe that guy doesn't even speak English, so he doesn't know what the box says, or does he care? So it's not, there's no uman along the way that was responsible for it, that his reputation is on the line, that he sold the wrong thing. Everybody just says, hey, this is what I got it for. I got ripped off. Nobody loses. Even in the local fish store, where you got some fellow being paid minimum wage to cut fish, if the sign on the counter has the wrong thing on it, so it's got the wrong thing on it, it's a mistake. I'm sorry, you want your money back? We'll give you your money back. No big deal. There's no uman maram nasei. Government supports that completely. There is no uman maram nasei b'nogea to any fresh, frozen, plain fish that you can say, if it has this name on it, it's got to be that thing. So Mamela, we are concerned with the concern that the fellow who took the skin off is now substituting it for something else. It's possible that it's not a dug tar anymore. And Mamela, you can't buy fish with no skin on it. Fish with no skin on it is going to be kirei dagim. That is OU policy, and as far as I know, every major organization accepts that. The exception, of course, would be if you bought a piece of fish with a tag of skin on it, that you would be able to identify it based on that tag of skin. So I have some examples of that. This is one of my favorites. This is a tuna fillet. Okay, let me hold that up. Everybody can see that well. Yeah. Hold it like this. Okay. This is a tuna fillet. This tuna fillet, it's really called tuna steak. So the way the tuna grows, imagine like a log of a tree. It's not that far off. So a very large fish, especially this kind of tuna, would be a large fish. The way it's cut is called a quarter loin. So imagine if you had a trunk of a tree and you cut it once up the long way, then you rotated it 90 degrees and cut it up the long way again, and you pulled off the 4 quadrants. That's called a quarter. Yeah, you quartered it, it's a quarter loin. The reason you do that is because the bones of the tuna, along with the guts, pretty much run like a chesed of access along the fish. So if you quarter loin it, you're cutting around the bones, right? The same way that when you would deal with a fish like branzino, you would fillet it along the length of the fish, half and half. You would just pull the meat, you cut it in a way that takes the maximum amount of meat off the bones in one shot. So on a tuna, that's a quarter loin. So when you quarter loin the fish, you're going to have skin all around the outside of the fish. Of course, if you would cut it all the way to the middle, there isn't necessarily going to be skin because you'd have to have all the way to the end of the fish. What they've done in this factory, this tuna came from my certified fish store without a hashgacha because it still has the skin on it. Now, can you see? So here's the meat. That's what the meat looks like. And here is the skin. Now the skin, in addition to just being skin, also still has scales intact. Here's some of the scales. We'll pull that off. Yep, see that nice big fat scale? Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't get so lucky. This one is full of scales. And yeah, there's another one. Doesn't matter what color they are, what shape they are, what size they are, so long as it is visible to the naked eye. Okay? So by buying tuna steaks with the skin still on, you're able to use a TS iron to know that it's tuna. And even if you didn't have a TS iron, all you have to do is open it up, pull some scales off, and now you know that it's a dog tar. Saves a lot of money, saves a lot of time, and it saves a lot of convenience too, because you don't have to send a mashgiach now to the manufacturing facility in order for it to be kosher. You could buy it from the open market. And now there's actually a lot more market for it. Companies with no hashgacha selling kosher tilapia, especially, because they realize that Jewish people will buy tilapia as long as there's a piece of skin on the fish. They'll rely on that without a hashgacha. So why should they pay you or anyone else to give hashgacha on a fish with the skin on it? And I have no problem with that. And there may be milas in that as well, because now you know as a consumer that it's a dog tar. The downside potentially would be if you don't think about that no one has actually checked this fish for simonim, that it's your obligation to check it, and depending on who the hashgacha is, they may be assuming that you know that you're supposed to check it. And many years ago, there was a big scandal about this. A certain fellow was selling retail bags of tilapia, and there was a patch of skin on each piece of tilapia. And the reason he did that was because they didn't want to spend the money on sending a mashgiach to China where the fish was being processed, and they left a patch of skin on it. And somebody called him up and asked him about this Rav Machsher, and he said, yeah, well, there's a piece of skin on it, so just check it when you get it home. Now, people didn't realize that they were expected to check it. So I would say to you, whenever you're buying fish with a patch of skin on it, you should assume that the Rav Machsher did not check it unless he tells you explicitly, or his mashgiach tells you explicitly, they did check it by checking out that patch of skin. Just your own idea. And we inform our mashgichim in food service that when they buy fish with skin on it, they must check it themselves, either for simanim or tefiyas ayin on it, because you can't just assume that if it came from so-and-so distributor and you told him it needs to be kosher, that it has hashgacha on it. If there's no hashgacha printed on sealed packaging, then it's nothing. You need to check the simanim on that fish itself. Okay, so I said if it's a plain white fish, you have to assume that it is not a dog tar unless it came with hashgacha. The exception to that, of course, is salmon. Now, salmon, or OU policy says, is acceptable without skin. Why is that? Because there is no non-kosher fish that looks like this. Now, I want to be clear what it is I am saying and what I'm not saying. People have misquoted me as saying that the OU holds there is no fish that is red except for salmon. Of course, that's not accurate. And I'll give you some examples. In addition to salmon, there's something called baby salmon. For those of you who are not aware, baby salmon is not juvenile salmon. It's actually trout. And if you look at them closely, sometimes you could see a difference in the color. And even if you can't, it's going to be harder to see from far away. The skin, if you would flip it over, this one still has the skin on it. If you would flip it over and compare the skin one to the other, they don't match at all. Salmon is going to be a silvery bluer kind of with a larger scale. Baby salmon is going to be more pink and much smaller scales because it's really a trout. It's not a salmon at all. There are many members of the salmonid family that will have red flesh. Another is salmon trout. Again, salmon trout, not the same thing as salmon, not the same thing as baby salmon. In addition to that, there is Arctic char, which is red. There is rainbow trout, sometimes can be red. There's steelhead trout, which could be red. There's lots of different members of the salmonid family, all of which are kosher. Nothing looks like a salmon and is not kosher. It hasn't been found. We're not mechuyev to be kosher that it exists. Therefore, OU policy has always been, and it was based on a situation that happened that Rav Nata Greenblatt asked Rav Moshe if the red color of a salmon could be a siman muvak, and we know that the siman muvak is oimev makom siman. And Rav Moshe said, if we know that all the fish that are red are kosher, then yes, it would be a siman muvak, and siman muvak is oimev makom siman. I want to ask Rav Belsky, who says that we fulfill that condition? Maybe we didn't check all the fish in the world. Rav Belsky said, we're familiar with all the fish by now, and we don't have to be worried that there's something out there until we are found otherwise. We know all the fish that are available, and there is nothing that is red flesh that doesn't look, there is nothing that looks like salmon with red flesh that is non-kosher. Why do I say like that? Because people ask, well, what about tuna? Tuna's also got red flesh, doesn't it? And tuna, we don't necessarily say is automatically kosher even without skin. The reason for that is we don't have the same level of guarantee on a tuna. It's possible that it's true. I've yet to find something which was non-kosher that really looked like a tuna. There are some billfishes, members of the billfish family that you could argue are not kosher and look similar-ish to tuna, but we're not comfortable making the statement that we're sure that anything that looks like a tuna is kosher. But we are comfortable making the statement that anything that looks like a salmon is going to be a dog tar, and therefore we're not concerned that you're going to get something that looks like a salmon and it's really not. Some years ago, someone noticed that when you buy farmed fish, there is a declaration on the label that it says contains color, or color added, or food coloring, or some other lashon that sounds like food coloring. It's not food coloring. It's actually carotenoids, which are like beta carotene. It's a vitamin found naturally in red-fleshed fruits and vegetables, particularly like squashes and sweet potatoes and all your beautifully colored fruits and vegetables. It's also found in the exoskeletons of shrimp and lobster, for example. Salmon in nature develop their red color from their diet of eating things like shrimp and lobster, which contain carotenoids. And when the fish processes it, it will turn the flesh of the salmon a red color. When they make farmed salmon, that color doesn't naturally develop because they don't feed it the same feed that natural salmon would have. So they add an artificial carotenoid to the feed in order for it to develop the red color. Some had asked, well, if you could feed salmon red color and make their flesh red, maybe you could feed catfish red color and turn them red. Okay. That isn't really sensical for lots of reasons. First of all, we had researched this and spoke to some experts in industry. One had pointed out that you realize that fish in nature are eating the same foods, give or take. Everyone's eating the same thing, and no one besides salmonid fish have red flesh, at least that color of red flesh, that type of red flesh that salmon have. So it's not magic that eating carotenoids automatically turns your flesh red. It turns the flesh of salmon red. It turns the skin of humans orange, which was why there are other carotenoids that are sold as artificial tanning pills, because it kind of makes your skin look, I don't know, orange. Some people want that. I don't know why, but okay. When I was researching it, I found references to that, canaxanthin and astaxanthin and xanthanthin, different carotenoids that were used in artificial tanning pills. In wild birds, they're not wild birds, expensive birds. They're often used to add to the feed in order to turn the feathers a prettier plume. In decorative koi, they turn the skin colors that are much brighter. Carotenoids have different effect on different things. One of the effects that carotenoids have on humans is that it affects the retinal function. And the EU put some limits on how much carotenoids you can add to salmon without causing damage because they were worried about that. But in any event, we researched it and we're pretty convinced that there's no way to add carotenoids to any other fish other than naturally absorbing salmonid fish that were kosher anyways in order to turn its flesh red. Somebody sent me a study that he had done trying to turn catfish redder. It was not peer reviewed. The fellow never sent it for peer review as far as we know. He spoke in relative terms that it was 5 times redder, except if you've ever looked at catfish, which are not kosher, their flesh is perfectly white, clear white, grayish white, whatever. The finished product, he would not send pictures of it, and he didn't include any in his study because it didn't get anything close to being red or reddish or on the red scale of any sense, even if relatively 5 times almost 0 is still 0. So we didn't see much concern about that. So OU policy remains that we're not concerned that if you find a red flesh fish and you know what salmon's supposed to look like, that it's a non-kosher fish. It may not be salmon, it may be baby salmon, it may be Arctic char, it may be some other fish, but it's not going to be treif. So the rule is, if it's a white fleshed fish and it doesn't have skin, you should assume it's not kosher, unless it has hashgacha, obviously. And if it's a salmon looking fish, even without skin, Orthodox Union policy would assume that it is kosher. Okay, so that's some of those products. I want to talk about 2 other things, and then I'll take some of your questions. What? A package of lox, smoked salmon. The biggest question we get about lox is if it's Bishul Yisrael or not. Not a good question, and I'll explain why. You have to know how smoked salmon is made and know a little bit something about raw fish versus cooked fish. The way you smoke salmon is as follows. You take raw fish, any fish, not just salmon, any fish, the way you smoke it, you take a raw fish, you apply salt. You can either dry rub it with salt and let it sit there for hours, or you can put it in an immersion, put it in a bathtub full of salt, sugar, whatever you want, and let it sit there for a few hours. After sitting in that salt for a few hours, the salt content in the fish will, get to the level you want it. You then take it and put it on a rack and slide that into a smoke oven. The smoke oven will blow smoke with fans around it at a temperature no higher than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. By law, once a fish has hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you can't leave it as a cold smoked fish, which is what lox is. You have to now bring it, it's broken 90 degrees. It now has to meet a protocol for a hot smoked fish, which requires a minimum internal temperature of 145 degrees for 30 minutes. There's like a range that you could sit for a lower temperature for a longer time or a higher temperature for less time. You understand, it's in order to kill bacteria. But the sweet spot to avoid is between 90 degrees and 145 degrees. You have to either keep it way below that or way above that in order to avoid bacterial growth. So in the case of lox, cold smoked salmon, it always remains below 90 degrees, usually below 85, because you don't want to take a chance of getting too high. So you have this salty fish sitting in an oven with ambient temperature smoke blowing around it with a fan. It sits there for a few hours, you take it out, you chill it, sometimes you even freeze it, and then you can slice it. So when somebody asks me about lox being Bishul Yisrael, I say, well, you just heard the process. It had to stay by law below 90 degrees. 90 degrees might make you feel like you're cooking in a classroom in the summer, but of course it's 100% raw, and since it's 100% raw, it's of no concern to being Bishul Yisrael. This guy says, yeah, but I heard you say that there's a thing called hot smoking, so maybe it's hot smoked salmon, which would be a Maisa Bishul, in which case it would require Bishul Yisrael. So a few things. First of all, you have to know the difference in texture between cold smoked, meaning raw fish, and cooked fish. So this is how we explain it to 5-year-olds, and it's a great way to remember it, even if you're a lot older than 5 years old. When your fish is raw, it wiggles. And if you've ever had lox, and I hope you have, hot, cold smoked salmon, and you put it on your bagel, you picked it up, and you could wiggle it, and then lay it over the top of your bagel, right? Now, if you ever had salmon for dinner, and you stuck a fork in it, you may have noticed that it crumbles, because cooked fish has a pellicle, the protein, shrivels together, and when you stick a fork in it, it will crack off. You'll have pieces of it, but it won't wiggle anymore. If you try and wiggle a cooked fish, it just falls apart, crumbles, and makes a crumbly mess. So that's your proof that lox is cold smoked. You can't make a hot smoked lox. It's not lox anymore. It's not a cold smoked fish. It's now a hot smoked fish. Its texture will be that of cooked salmon, similar to what you've eaten for dinner. And when you, again, stick a fork in it, it will crumble. So there is no Bishul Yisrael on this, and companies claiming Bishul Yisrael on their locks, it's a false claim. I mean, obviously it's a false claim. So do with it whatever you want to do with that. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about before I take your questions is sushi. Sometimes we get the question, can we buy sushi without a hashgacha? Okay, so there's some problems buying sushi without hashgacha. First of all, how do you know what fish is being used in the sushi? Right? Because once you took the skin off it, we don't know what fish it is. The guy said it's yellowtail. There's no way to know if it really is yellowtail or if it's something else. I don't know what it could be. But the bottom line is it's kirei dagim. It's at least in this bon and suffix so you can't eat the fish. In addition to that, there's some rice that goes around this, which is not edible raw. And pashtus, it is oil al shulchan malachim, which means it's shayach to bishul akum, in which case you can't eat it anyways because you can't eat bishul akum unless it's food that's been cooked by a Jew, which, of course, without hashgacha, that's not happening. The vegetables that go inside are regularly pickled in wine vinegar, so that's a stam yenam shaila. And the nori sheet, that brownish, greenish layer that swirls around on the outside, is a layer of seaweed that, if it hasn't been prepared with a hashgacha, could potentially have little shrimps and seahorses that are visible in it. And I've heard from mashgichim who checked and did see small shrimps and seahorses in it, which is a problem. You got to make sure that that isn't happening. In addition, when it's toasted nori is often toasted on the same equipment as flavored noris, which would include shrimp flavored and chicken flavored nori. That's an industry standard. So theoretically, if you would have bought this sushi from a non-kosher sushi spot, you'd have to be throwing away the fish, the rice, the vegetables, the nori, and all you would be left with, of course, is the plastic container, which if you really wanted to eat it, you would have to wash it because it just touched non-kosher sushi. Okay, I will take some questions. Somebody wants to know, Alicia Pearl wants to know, what about the non-kosher knife that had been used to cut the fish? Maybe it was used to cut onion / catfish mix. Okay, I'm not worried about it cutting onion or catfish because that cutting an onion would be a problem to the onion, not a problem to my fish. Let's say I know for a fact that this fellow who cut the fish at a non-kosher store cut a hot pastrami sandwich the second before he cut my fish. So now what do I do? Okay, so I go into a non-kosher fish store and this fellow is cutting up fish. So the non-kosher fish store, I know myself, I've been to the ones in Chinatown where they cut up things that you otherwise only know from Makas Mitzrayim, and they sell them by the pound. If you ever want to buy frogs, for example, that's a much better place to buy them than the pet store because they're much more lebedik in the Chinese fish department than they ever are in the pet shop. The pet shop, they don't really care if they're alive or dead. In the fish store, they're very makbid to get good quality frogs. So I would personally recommend that would be the place I would go shopping if I was in the market for a frog, not for eating for a pet. So the guy just chopped a frog, and right before he did my piece of fish, and I was completely grossed out. And when they wash, this is how they wash. They take like a garden hose and they just spritz a bunch and then they go. But it was still covered with all kinds of mess and whatever, carry on from whatever he has killed earlier in the day. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to wash it with not hot water. You're going to scrape it with a non-serrated knife, and then you're going to rinse it off again. Can you still hear me? Oh, you kicked my phone. That's fine. So if you want to see where it is, I just looked it up. It's the Piskei Tshuva at the end of Tzadi Vav in your Yeridea. Talks about this procedure. Pashtus, you should just be able to rinse it. But Lamaisa, he tells you that you should be garbe paske, kind of like you would for cucumbers. Just wash it, scrape it, wash off what happens, and you don't have to be worried about it. Why is there an OU on salmon that's prepackaged and frozen, for example, from Costco? The same reason that there's OUs on bottled water and salt and sugar and lots of other things that we hold don't require hashgacha. Because somebody paid for it. And the guy who paid for it is selling to customers who asked for it. The customer who asked for it wants to know that the OU holds that this salmon is good the way it is. No cheshbainas, no worrying, no rinsing, scraping, washing. If you heard how many nervous people called our office on a daily basis, you would find people that I would tell them, it's not a problem. You could buy from a trade store. I'll tell you how to do it. They'll be, no. Get me with hashgacha, which is fine. That's what you want. That's what we provide. As far as the cost is concerned, it's so minimal. Costco's producer spends more money on tissues for their workers every year than they do on their hashgacha fee. So that's really where it's holding. It's a nominal thing for them. And when they add on additional factories, these guys come running to us that in order to get the Costco contract, they got to prove they have OU, and they're ready to pay because they need it in order to get the Costco contract. And they're very happy to greet the rabbi, and we don't have any issues with that. If there's any other questions,
thank you, Rabbi Goldberg.
have a good day, everyone.